All right, welcome back, everybody. We are answering your questions, and we are going to jump right back in. Shannon, you have one for me, so lay it on me, please.
Sure. Yeah, so this question came in from Christy, also submitted through our Facebook page, so folks feel free to do that if you do have questions for us. But Christy says that it's her understanding that a test optional policy, and by the way, she submitted this after our, I believe it was January 9th test optional segment. So for folks interested in test optional schools, go back and listen to that. But she said it's her understanding that a test optional policy is used so that colleges can consider first generation, rural, or underrepresented students who have a disadvantage when it comes to testing. She says that the University of Chicago has been pretty clear about that. Yet other schools just say their admissions are holistic for all students. Does College Coach believe that? Are there test optional schools that would truly consider a student from, say, a highly regarded high school with high average SAT scores if they applied without scores? Schools like Bates and Bowdoin and Wake Forest, is a student really not at a disadvantage applying without scores if they come from a situation where the college would expect a solid SAT score? This is what Christy says, I don't think test optional is really test optional for those students, but I would love to be proven wrong.
Well, Christy, in a word, you're wrong. So while Chicago states that policy, that is Chicago's policy and Chicago's policy alone. All the other schools prior to COVID-19, I want to make that clarification, who have introduced test optional policies, you named a couple of them, Bates, Bowdoin, Wake Forest, American, have done so because they truly believe that they do not need test scores in order to accurately evaluate a student's qualifications and ability to succeed. Because let's not forget, the whole point of test scores is, in theory, that they are, in a way, they're predicting the student's likelihood of being successful. What these test optional schools have shown after introducing test optional policies is that there is no difference between how successful the students are who they admit with test scores are from the students who they admit without test scores. So I'm not sure how I can prove you wrong. You will believe me or you won't believe me, but the reality is that if they are test optional, they have done so for philosophical reasons, and they truly believe that they do not need those test scores. And a student will not be at a disadvantage if they don't submit them to a test optional school. And I will tell you that actually, I believe the very first, or it might have been the very second podcast that we ever did here, Getting In, a College Coach Conversation, so going back 5 years, we invited an admissions officer from American University, one of the earlier adopters of test optional, to talk about how they view test optional and answer exactly these questions. We know from people who work on our staff who have worked at test optional schools that if a student actually accidentally submits scores and then says, I don't want them considered, they do not make it into the file. So when we used to read on paper, they would be blacked out. And if the student is reading, or if the admissions officer is reading online, those scores are suppressed and the admissions officer does not even see them. All that means is that when you are considering applications, you simply are considering all of the other pieces and evaluating them. You're eliminating one element of evaluation, so it makes the other pieces more important.
Right.
But it does not make that student less competitive. It just means that they have chosen not to do test optional. Now, with that said, there are schools who are going test optional for the coming year. Some who have said, we're doing this for the next 3 years. Tufts comes to mind immediately. They were already considering test optional, and they're looking at this as a great opportunity to see if what they think will be beneficial about test optional actually is. They're going to test it for the next 3 years. They're going to evaluate it at that point, and then they will decide if they're going to continue with test optional or go back to requiring test scores. Other schools have been very clear, this is literally for the coming year and that's it. Although I do think it will be interesting to see if they feel that they are able to similarly evaluate students properly without the help of test scores. If they sort of say, you know what, this is kind of interesting, maybe we continue this for another year or two and see what those results are. So I actually do think that what might happen as a result of coronavirus is that we might see a lot more schools go to test optional if they realize that, wow, this wasn't so terrible, and we actually didn't miss those scores. That said, the highly selectives, which I hate to harp on because it's such a small percentage of students looking at those schools, but the reality is that at those schools, what some of them have come out very strongly and said, don't worry about subject tests. We are not recommending them. Actually, MIT announced they will not even consider subject tests, whether you have them or whether you don't. And that appears to be like their new policy in general and nothing to do with coronavirus. But Penn, I think there's one other highly selective, and for whatever reason I'm blanking right now, have said basically, don't worry about test scores. We do really want you to have an ACT or an SAT if you can. I believe as we go into the fall, if it is not possible to get these scores done because test dates keep getting canceled, and there are a lot of questions about the in-home version that the ACT and the SAT are going to offer, I do wonder if we're not going to see all of these schools go test optional. However, if you have scores and they're solid, that's great. But I think in closing, I have really veered a little bit from the original question, but in closing, if the school is test optional, they truly believe test optional is core to their mission, and it will not hurt a student not to have scores at those schools who have said, this is our policy, either moving forward or for at least the next 3 years.
Perfect. And you know what, not to keep you on the hot spot, Beth, but I'm wondering if we should hit, Christy actually submitted a follow-up question on the same subject. So to just, while we're on it, if the student is in the middle 50th percentile for scores, then is that the cutoff for sending them or not sending them? I've heard the advice to call the admissions offices, but honestly, how can they guide you when they aren't seeing the rest of the app?
I mean, it's a very good question. I've heard that same advice. I've given that same advice. I would say that general rule of thumb is that if the scores aren't at least in the middle 50% of their published scores, then I would not send them. If they're on the lower end of the 50%, that's kind of when I think it starts to get a little bit tricky. Like, do I send them? Do I not send them? I think the first thing that I would be looking at is, what is that school saying about their expectations for the rigor of the student's curriculum, for their actual grades that they're earning? If your student looks like they're in a good place with those pieces, then maybe if the scores are on the lower end of the middle 50%, you don't send them. But the reason that we recommend calling is because you'd be surprised, a lot of times admissions offices are going to be as transparent with you as they can be, particularly about this. Because if you tell them the scores, they may know that, you know what, I don't think that those are really going to help you. Right? Even without necessarily knowing about the rest of the application, they could say, I don't think those scores are going to help you. As we've already talked about, if you don't submit scores, everything else becomes more important. But if they think the scores just aren't going to help you, they can tell you that without knowing anything else, right? Yep. So that is a reason why you might call, because maybe they're on the lower end of the middle 50% and you're thinking, well, it's still in the middle 50%, but you call the admissions office and they say, yeah, they are still in the middle 50%, but we don't have that many kids getting in at the low end of that middle 50%. And so I think I would just not send them. So again, they may not be as transparent as you would want them to be, but there is literally zero harm in calling. No one's making a mark in your file and saying, call to ask if they should send those. They must be bad. That is not happening. They are going to answer your question. It's not going to impact your students' chances of getting in. And so that's why we do recommend making that phone call.
Perfect.
All right. Let's go to you, Shannon. And this question, next question, comes to us from Keith. Keith says, I didn't apply for financial aid yet, as I didn't want to hurt my son's chances for acceptance. Is it too late to apply for aid now that he's been accepted? If not this year, can we still apply for financial aid in subsequent years? Keith, you need to listen to our show more. That was probably not your best choice, but okay. Shannon, what are your thoughts here?
Thank you for taking care of that part of it for me.
Yeah, sorry.
Please don't do this, folks. If in fact you need financial aid, please, please, please apply for it. There is no use getting into a school if you can't afford to actually attend.
Yes.
So if you need financial aid, please apply for it. Please apply by their deadline. But if you haven't done that, like Keith there, and I'm assuming and hoping that Keith doesn't really need financial aid, and maybe he wants some, but he can get by without it. And that's why he did this. But so Keith, can you apply now? You can. Whether or not you will receive any money now is another question, though, and one I can't answer for you because it truly depends on the school. There are some colleges that are very, very strict about their deadline, and you miss it by one day, that's it. You're not getting any financial aid from them. You can still get some guaranteed federal student loans, no matter how late you apply, but at some schools, in terms of any institutional grant money, which is really what you're hoping for in most cases, that may be off the table for this year at this point. You never know, though. Just like in terms of asking about test scores of the admissions office, it never hurts to ask if you can apply for financial aid. At this point, you've already been accepted. It's not going to hurt your chances of acceptance. So go ahead and apply for it and see what happens. I have found schools being kind of more generous in this application cycle with people requesting funds maybe a little bit late, or maybe asking for more money than they originally received, because schools are, I think, really anxious about filling the seats in their class for this upcoming fall. And so you may get lucky. Maybe in another year, a school would have said no at this point, and maybe they say yes. So go ahead and apply for financial aid. You may or may not receive it for this year if you've already missed the school's deadline, which you probably have. And in terms of next year, I would say most schools, you are okay to apply for aid for next year. Certainly not all schools, though. There are some schools that are very strict where you don't apply for aid initially. Sorry, you are never getting financial aid from our school for the next 4 years. And if you have a change in circumstances, maybe some schools will consider that. Some schools really won't. There are a few, I would say, really, really strict schools out there where you're just out of luck for 4 years. So I would say make sure that you understand if you can, in fact, afford the school for 4 years without financial aid before you make that final enrollment decision. If you can't, don't enroll in that school. But before making that decision, I would have a conversation with the financial aid office. Apply for financial aid for this year, see if they give it to you. If not, hey, can I still apply next year? Will I receive financial aid potentially next year, or is this it? They will tell you that. Again, they're going to be transparent. If their policy is you don't get it for 4 years, they'll tell you that. So make sure you have that conversation before making any enrollment decisions.
Yeah. Can I just put a plug in here for, if you think you need financial aid, you absolutely should be applying for it. It is not worth it to play this game. The reality is that at schools that are need aware, it's really kids who are on the bubble who yes. It is, and by on the bubble, I mean, they were already maybe not super competitive. And then in addition to that, they need a lot of aid. Those are the kids who probably will suffer. And I get the desire for your kid to be as competitive as possible, but does it do anybody any good if they end up in a huge amount of debt, or if you do, or if you end up paying way more for college than you really should because you do qualify for aid? I don't think I can stress enough. And to Shannon's point, I think it's worth filling out the FAFSA and going through the application process, because what if something like this happens again? You want to at least have the right and the ability to apply for aid. And like I know of some schools where if you don't apply for aid freshman year, you're out. That's it. You're never going to get any aid. And that's it's so much money. It just doesn't seem to make sense.
Exactly.
Yeah, I don't know if we have time for one more question. I guess it depends on if the answer is a short one, Shannon. And
well, I know that this one is a short one.
Okay.
My junior is struggling with volunteering, finding opportunities to help bolster her resume with activities aligned with her interest in the medical community. She's interested in nursing. Do you have any ideas?
Yes, and the reason this is a short one is because off the top of my head, no. However, next week's show, we are one of our colleagues, Lauren DiProspero, who is the former director of admissions for medical school at both Stanford and Columbia, is joining the show and is going to be offering suggestions for things that students who plan to apply to medical school, or actually who plan to be going to college and ultimately want to be doctors, can be doing with their time. And I would say those suggestions are going to apply across the spectrum of health related majors and interests. So I would check that out. Shannon, thank you so much for being here today and giving such great responses to our listener questions.
You're so welcome.
Yes, the next week, Ian is back. He is hosting. We're talking about, I just shared the med school piece. Also, how colleges are going to view pass-fail grades. We talked a lot about grades and rigor and GPAs. What happens if you don't get grades this semester? We're going to talk you through that. Also talking about how to think about funding college beyond the financial aid award. Don't forget to visit our website if you have a question, gettingin.voiceamerica@gmail.com. And we are here every Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern and 1 p.m. Pacific.